you look in your chat window, I'm putting a little check-in request or question. In the spirit of the theme of burnout here, we're going to ask you to share how you're doing when it comes to burnout at the moment. On a scale of 1 to 10, how burnt out are you at this moment? 1 is cool as a cucumber, and 10 is that you're completely cooked. So I want to kind of give a little rating for how you're doing. That would be great.
Hey, Chris.
So are you
back?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
We'll probably give a few minutes for people to find their way in, since it's noon on the East Coast and 9 on the West Coast. We'll give folks a little bit of buffer before we jump in.
Can answer our own chat question.
I can
Find my
answer.
chat window here.
I'll
I'm
burn
gonna keep putting this in there because everyone who comes in is gonna have to see it again. So, welcome, Ken.
Hey, Ken.
Chris. All right,
Hi, Matt.
on.
How you been?
All right, I got terrible backlighting here. Let me correct that.
Okay.
Well, I thought you were going to be our 60-minute secret source. Actually, Ken. We got 3s and 5s so far on the burnout rating. Thanks for checking in, folks.
For me, it's situational. You know, on some things I'm great, and you know, with some people, I'm just like little.
Fair enough, Matt. Yeah, and welcome, Julie,
Jasmine.
Markish, and Jasmine.
Yeah.
For newcomers, we're asking you to check in on your level of burnout at the moment. We're going to get started in a minute here. Johnny, glad to hear. Our oldest person is I'm guessing, is our coolest at the moment. So that's great.
Jasmine, a solid 8, but you're working on that, right? You got a plan. Good seeing you.
Hopefully,
All right,
this
so
provides a little bit.
Matt and Jim, should I kick us off now, or do we want to wait a little bit longer?
Give it like 1 more minute.
Okay. I'll put the prompt in one more time. I don't see. I'm curious to hear how Julia Markish is going to weigh in here.
Melissa, I hope your new job will be a part of decreasing that number for you, and hopefully we can help you out a little bit today too.
Thanks. Yeah.
All right, we got another 5 from Julia, so that's better than 8, 9, or 10 for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So,
Oops.
Jim and Matt, should we get going?
Yeah, let's do this.
Go.
Like, if people
All right.
straggle in, they straggle in.
Exactly. Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the shameless good fortune of intimacy. 2 guys' stories of overcoming burnout. I'm Ed Fraunheim. I'm a friend to the 2 guys who are going to share their stories today, Jim Young and Matt Spohr. And I'm excited to play the role of moderator today. You might be wondering about our intriguing title, The Shameless Good Fortune of Intimacy. This is a clever mashup of the themes and titles of Jim's and Matt's new books. Jim's book is called, I'm going to show you, maybe many of you probably have it already, Expansive Intimacy, How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout. And it is a real wonderful exploration of how shame plays a big role in burnout for men, among other things, and the intimacy as an antidote to that. And Matt's new book is Making a Small Fortune, Surviving Publishing, Parenting, and Porphyria. And in it, he tells a candid tale of the stress of launching a new business. At the same time, he became a stepfather and had to deal with life-threatening illnesses in his family. And I think their mashup makes a lot of sense. And I hope you'll agree, especially today when an estimated 41% of Americans are feeling burned out from work. And that research suggests that nearly 24 million men in particular are depleted from their jobs. Jim and Matt have the experience and the wisdom to really help us address this burnout crisis, which really is kind of like a 5-alarm fire, talking about being fully cooked. We're really struggling with this in America and beyond. So in today's event, Jim and Matt are going to be alternating, sharing some passages from their books, and then we'll also be posing some questions for you as audience members to respond to and wrestle with in the chat. And at the end, by the way, we're going to give away some of their books. So I encourage you to stick around for those closing gifts. And if you have questions or comments along the way, feel free to pose them in the chat as we go along. And as a starting point, I'd love to invite everyone just to give Jim and Matt a little love, a little cheers for putting themselves out there with these really lovely books. So can we give them a little round of applause or cheers as we get started here? Woo! Maybe people are saying stuff in the chat. And with that, I would like you to be quiet now, please, everybody. So for the sake of a smooth listening experience, could everybody please mute yourself throughout most of the event today? So without further ado, let me turn things over to my friend Jim Young, who's going to kick off the book sharing. Jim?
Thanks, Ed. We also should note that Ed is an author of a fantastic book called Reinventing Masculinity, and we might even give away one of those today too. I don't know if you're up for that, Ed, but let's do it. So thanks again. As you can see, my book's right behind me there, as Ed showed. It's called Expansive Intimacy, How Tough Guys Defeat Burnout. And what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through, using the structure of my book, Matt and I will trade off some stories and a little commentary looking at burnout, then looking at shame, and then looking at intimacy. Those are the three themes that I covered in the book. And as somebody who experienced burnout in my career, I went through an extended period of time, probably, I don't know, 5 to 7 years on the burnout spectrum at various points of that, including full-on burnout. I came to understand viscerally and then later on academically that burnout consists of 3 core symptoms: exhaustion, cynicism, and a lack of sense of efficacy, not being able to get things done as well as you once were able to. And as I came out of burnout, I tried to retrace those a little bit and understand a little bit more about them. And I did a bunch of research. And one of the pieces of research that I found was from an MD by the name of Dyke Drummond, who has since gone on, he burned out of healthcare and has gone on to become an advocate for burnout in the healthcare industry. And one of the things that I read from him that really struck me was this concept that burnout is not a problem. And when I heard that and read that, I was like, how could that not be a problem? It just talked about it. 24 million men, 41% of workers surveyed. There's all these statistics that show how much burnout is affecting us. How could it not be a problem? And what he goes on to describe is that problems have solutions. If I've got a flat tire, I have a bunch of solutions. I can call AAA, I can replace the tire, I can hail a cab, problem solved. But burnout doesn't behave that way. It's a dilemma. There's no one singular solution for it. And so I want to read, a passage that talks a little bit about that. So you'll hear me reference Dyke Drummond in this passage from some of the preceding parts of the chapter. This is from page 60, a chapter called You Can't Solve Burnout. And it goes a little something like this. I'm going to be looking down at my other screen here as I read. Burnout has common causes. Many of them are sourced from the demands we face at work. There are pressures that are typically beyond our control, in particular for the everyday employee. We'll take a side note. Burnout is not strictly a workplace syndrome, as the World Health Organization says. I don't agree with that assessment. We can get burned out through our personal lives as well as a parent or a caregiver or other roles. So there are pressures that are typically beyond our control, in particular for the everyday employee. They're born from imperatives like having to meet a quota, attending a seemingly endless string of meetings, and being responsible for an ever-growing list of tasks and priorities. Those stressors are exacerbated when we don't receive the time and space we need to rest, recharge, and retrain. And similarly, they are worsened when we don't receive adequate social support from our peers. Not only did I see these conditions in Dyke's story, as well as in dozens of other men with whom I've talked about burnout, but my own path was paved with the same stones. Despite my best efforts within a role with great authority, I ultimately lacked control over the outcomes for which I was responsible. Bouncing from meeting to meeting and crisis to crisis, I rarely had a moment to slow down and allow others to understand how much pressure I was under. At nearly every new rung I reached on the corporate ladder, I found myself having to take on more responsibility while learning a new set of skills on the fly, typically without any formal training. I was a dedicated dad who was also the sole wage earner in my family. That position put me in a crunch of competing demands that kept increasing both at home and at work as my family grew bigger and my role at work expanded. During that time, I also endured the loss of an important caregiver in my life when I needed their support the most. The overlapping and at times contradictory demands of modern life are vexing. Like many men, both Dyke and I were striving to make a difference through our work. It was also the job that brought in the money that allowed us to take care of our families. And at the same time, we wanted to play active, engaged roles with our spouses and kids. Ultimately, we both ran into obstacles that we couldn't get around, over, or through. This was true despite taking personal responsibility to do excellent work, regardless of our circumstances. Adversity was never a reason to give up. Eventually, though, we were both hindered by the systems in which we worked. Like so many others, our workplaces operated in ways that either didn't see or didn't care to acknowledge the conditions that were burning us out. I'll turn that over to Matt. He's going to read us a segment of his book. Just play a spotlight here.
Hey, everybody. So, yeah, this is going back a little ways in my life, but in the 90s, as they were drawing to a close, I was pretty burned out from years of working in the tech industry and not having a very supportive marriage at home. And you'll certainly read about that in the book. So what does one do when you find yourself in that situation? You go to graduate school and you get divorced, right? Which might have been a solution, or at least part of the dilemma, as Jim pointed out. But I hadn't really learned my lesson, because right out of graduate school, I remarried and started up my own business. So it was just right back into the frying pan. So this is, that led me to where I was. I'm going to read a passage about just how stressful it was. I think this really talks to exhaustion more than anything else. But I think a lot of people can relate. So if we had one regular income for the household, we'd be okay financially. I didn't have time for another second job. In caring for Connie and Brad, I was already running a clinic for 2. At home, I'd converted the low bookcases in our living room into our clinic inventory. The shoebox-sized delivery boxes for medical supplies became labeled trays. Every few days, a new delivery arrived from the home health company. I unpacked supplies, compared quantities against packing lists, and stored items in their assigned places. It was the only way to keep it all straight. The 20-gauge syringe needles, the angled needles for accessing chest ports, the IV tubes and line locks and connectors, the alcohol wipes, betadine swabs, cloth tape, plastic tape, gauze, elastic bandages, Duraskin, dressing kits, latex gloves, surgical masks, catheter tubes, scissors, tweezers, empty 10 milliliter syringes, 5 milliliter heparin syringes, 5 milliliter and 20 milliliter saline syringes, 9-volt and AA and C-cell batteries, and instruction manuals for running and configuring and reprogramming various pumps and devices to administer different medications. The home healthcare company also delivered Ziploc bags full of intravenous drugs. These I stored in the refrigerator: morphine for pain, Phenergan and Compazine for nausea, and occasionally antibiotics and antifungals like Rocephin, piperacillin, and Lavaquin. In the morning, I'd wake, shower, and eat, then tend to Connie before going to work. She sat in bed reading the daily newspaper under her full spectrum light. Her breakfast was usually coffee and peanut butter toast, the crusts of which she gave to Henry the dog. Many days, she also had a small mug of vanilla ice cream, thinned with a little milk. I'd kiss Connie's forehead and say goodbye as she was taking her pills for the morning. In the evening, I returned from the newspaper, cooked dinner for Walt and Chris, performed my clinic duties, and then finally collapsed into bed. It was getting harder and harder for me to focus on the 90% chance of nothing permanently bad coming from porphyria. I had plenty on my mind to keep me awake, but exhaustion and the white noise of medical devices usually dropped me straight to sleep.
Thanks, Matt and Jim. And we're going to take this moment to invite everybody else to reflect on a first question that yeah, it relates to what Matt just shared there. If I can get my cut and paste function to work. We're going to ask you to think about which of these 3 burnout components might you identify with most, maybe struggle with. You know, Matt's passage was really about exhaustion. Jim also mentioned, though, the cynicism and lack of efficacy that kind of spoke to his experience as well, I think, at work. So take a moment to think about what really kind of hits you, or do you maybe struggle with, of these 3. And if you want to say a bit more about why or how, you're welcome to put that in as well.
I'll just throw a note in from some of the research that I did during writing my book, that you may find that you can't tease them apart. Cynicism and exhaustion in particular feed on each other. They stimulate one another. So once you're in one of those, you may find that the other one tag teams right along. The other thing that I think is worth noting around exhaustion is that it is not just about being physically tired. It's the emotional and mental exhaustion. I even throw spiritual into that as well, thinking about exhaustion.
I've seen a couple of cynicisms. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple lack of efficacies. That's what I shared, and seeing Julia and Jasmine chime in on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, small mistakes or not being able to remember things as well. That's definitely one of the things that gets me. Mm-hmm.
Ooh.
Melissa's adding to the research here with irritability. I'm curious how that lands for you, Jim or Matt. Combination of exhaustion and cynicism.
That's a great definition.
Yeah, that sounds like the felt sense of those symptoms in kind of real life terms, right? Feel irritable, feel cranky, feel whatever it is.
Super. Jim and Matt, I'm curious to hear from maybe one of the cynicism fellas about if they'd care to expand on that before we move to the next one. Is that
Sure.
Can we pause for a second? I wonder if Matt or Chris, or excuse me, Sean or Chris would maybe care to share a bit more what that means for you, or how that shows up for you all.
Chris, you want to go? You want me to go?
Why don't you go ahead, Sean? I see you got the mic there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's I think for me the cynicism is just a lot of judgment comes in, a lot of frustration, and things that I cared about, I find more opportunities to be critical about. And so I think it's just this kind of, it kind of, sometimes it feels a little schizophrenic or a little irrational, but just where my irritability comes in, and what can trigger or spark that.
Thanks, Sean.
Maybe that's actually a good segue to the next section, because I think we're going to get into self-judgment a bit here in the next passage. Should we move on to that, Jim and Matt?
Let's do it.
So back to you, Jim. Thanks for everyone for throwing your comments in here. I know people are being vulnerable, and I really appreciate that.
All right, so as I said at the top, the 3 components of my book were burnout, shame, and intimacy. And when I started writing the book, there were only 2 components. There was burnout and there was intimacy, and that's all I intended to write about. And I remember getting a comment one day as I was writing the manuscript from my developmental editor, who asked me about a point that I was making, asking, what's the role of stigma in this? And I thought, great question. I started to go off and do some research. And I started to get into the research around the stigma around mental health, and burnout as a mental health condition. And that quickly led me into a topic that, frankly, I didn't really want to write about. I didn't want to be writing about shame, talking about shame, thinking about my own shame, dealing with my shame in the process of writing this. And yet I just couldn't avoid it as I started to explore this and talk to other people about it, including I interviewed dozens of men for this book, and the theme was so strong, it just kept coming up. And so I realized, okay, I really need to dive into this and understand what is the role that shame plays in getting men into burnout. And oftentimes that is by not feeling like we haven't lived up to some sort of standard. We aren't man enough. We haven't succeeded as a man because something doesn't feel right and that feels weak. And any sign of weakness for men is a source of shame. And I'm quoting Brene Brown's research on that. So I'd like to read a passage, a little bit more of a story that gets into that. This is on page 84 of the book from a chapter called Insidious Bedfellows. And this section is called Avoiding the Church Lady, which has nothing to do with Dana Carvey for you Saturday Night Live fans out there.
Jim, could you turn up your volume just a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I can get a little closer to the mic. I think maybe it's just how's that?
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
that's better. Okay.
I would never go quite so far as to say that I was homeless. But when you're in your mid-40s, holding down a high-level corporate job, and you find yourself sleeping under 5 different roofs in the span of a week, let's just say that you don't feel grounded. In the days immediately following my separation from my then wife, I ran smack dab into a hard truth. I'd been so focused on showing up at work as if nothing was going on, while simultaneously getting my kids moved to the house they would now be calling home, that I hadn't checked off the finding a place to live entry on my to-do list. After bouncing between some awkward nights on friends' couches and a well-timed hotel stay on a business trip, I finally had to face the pain of revealing my situation to someone and asking for help. I don't even remember how I decided to call her, but I picked up the phone and I dialed up Nancy, an older woman I knew from church. Nancy had been widowed the previous year, so I thought that maybe she'd have a spare room and would welcome some company. Thankfully, she was happy to lend a hand. For the next few months, I lived in Nancy's spare bedroom half of the week, and in the house where my kids lived the other half. On my Nancy days, I would invariably go to work early and stay very late. While she was a wonderful host who reminded me of my dear grandmother with her gentle inquisitiveness and positive outlook on life, I was reluctant to spend too much time with her. I worried she'd ask a question that would force me to have to confront the painful vision of myself that I was holding deep down inside. Frankly speaking, I was ashamed. Ashamed that the breakdown of my marriage meant that I was inadequate. Ashamed that I wasn't even worthy enough for my own family. Ashamed that I felt like, sorry, my window's in the way here. Ashamed that I felt like a failure, and that my once perfect life was now out of control. And I sure as hell didn't want anyone to know that.
Thanks, Jim.
That's one of the stories of how shame showed up in my burnout story. And I'll pass this over to Matt.
Yeah, for me, my little shame story here, to pick up on one of Jim's earlier themes, is it's not related to work, it's personal life. When I remarried after graduate school, it's actually my 3rd marriage before 40, which is really nothing to brag about, to say the least. So that's what I'm going to talk about. When it's your 3rd marriage, you can relax and do things differently. First weddings are anxious. Second weddings are like a patient in a hospital gown, exposed and embarrassed and wanting it all over soon. By the 3rd wedding, most of the nerves and shame are gone. Although Connie and I and the 3 boys and 3 cats already lived together, I felt nervous about standing before my family and doing the marriage thing again. At 37, this was my 3rd marriage as well. My parents, sister, and brother had all remained in their marriages for decades. So what was my problem? Certainly, I didn't want to fail again. I tried to alleviate my embarrassment by referring to our entire wedding week as the weenie roast. Luckily, the logistics of a wedding provided lots of practical challenges to distract me from my feelings. I've always carried some shame about my checkered history with relationships. I even joked that my sister was an elementary school librarian and my brother was an Eagle Scout. so I must be the black sheep of our family. Logically, this all seems silly, I know, especially in the land of memoirs. Other authors confess actually shocking things in their memoirs that make my failed relationships seem boring. But I needed the time to come to terms with this sense of shame as well. Even now, while writing this, part of me is panicked at sharing so much about my past.
Wow. Thank you, Matt and Jim. And just resonating with both of your stories there in my own life a little bit, and thinking about those as a guy as well, the power of not the powerful impact of not living up to these expectations of being successful as in a career and in relationships. So thank you for those vulnerable sharings. And now we're going to ask all of the folks here to share a little bit about shame. And the question we have, I just put in the chat here for you, is, do you feel shame around your component of burnout that we just talked about before? Again, the efficacy, cynicism, exhaustion pieces, and none, a little, some, or a lot. So take a moment to share your thoughts here, if you would.
And of course, only share if you feel safe in doing so, especially around a topic like shame. It can be difficult for any of us. And I'll also put in the note that I learned from a lot of my research over the years prior to the book as well, is that sharing my shame has always been the way to get through it. So if you feel safe, it can be really healing to do that.
Appreciate that, folks sharing so far here. Jasmine's mentioning the Protestant work ethic, for sure, affects so many of us.
Yeah, I definitely connect with what you wrote, Julia, that I'm supposed to have it all together.
Sean, you continue to be provocative, to me at least. I'm curious if you could say a bit more about the none response, if you're willing to share a bit there.
Yeah, burnout's not a place where I feel shame. I mean, even among these three, I mean, I feel shame in other places, but burnout's not one of them. Burnout is, I think, it doesn't conjure up those feelings of either less than, or there's something wrong, or it just, to me, it's more of it is what it is. But in other aspects of my life, that's where I can see the shame. I can feel the shame, but this isn't one of those places.
I appreciate that. I know you've done so much thoughtful reflection on systems and how really we are in systems that lead to some of these problems. I wonder if that's part of it, is not blaming yourself for when you might feel like you're not being as effective, or the exhaustion pieces, because I gather I've learned from you that this is not our fault necessarily. Is that part of it?
I mean, I guess as an organization development person, the feelings are data. And so it's more of like, in this setting, if I'm feeling resistance, or I'm feeling that cynicism, or I'm feeling that anger, I look at it more as information and data than I do something that is inherently wrong with me, or that, because I always distinguish, shame to me is always when I feel something, I am that thing. And so I am not the failure that I'm, even if I feel I'm failing, I don't take on the ownership that I am a failure, or I am failing. So the shame doesn't show up in those places. In relationships around other things, yeah. When it comes to work, I tend to, or in this space, I look at it more as data.
I appreciate that. Jim or Matt, are there any comments you'd want to speak to? Folks are really sharing a lot of stuff here in the chat.
Well, I just love that what Sean just called out, just around the simple definition of guilt and shame, because that's what I've had to learn is Guilt is I did bad, shame is I am bad. And I heard that in what you were sharing, Sean. And Ken wrote something about a dream that is recurring, and the primary feeling of it being shame of not I'm not sure what those dreams are about, but work failures. And to me, that's a similar feeling. If I look back at my failures, I start to think, well, somebody else would have done it better. I'm not measuring up. That's what it's always been to me. And in my book, I couldn't find a term for shame that I liked in some of the clinical research I did. I started calling it social comparison shame. When I compare myself to my peers or the general society and I don't measure up, that's when I start to get shame. And that's where I started to see a pattern around burnout, where people, when they're comparing, and I didn't get that, I didn't get the job that my high school, college buddy did. I don't have the nicest car, whatever that measure of status is, we then start to double down and work harder. And that can push us into burnout. So that was one of the links between shame and burnout that I found.
Melissa, just appreciating your point about the parenting elements of shame, and I think Matt's book speaks to that some. I've definitely experienced some of that too.
Mm-hmm.
Should we move to the solution, not to this quote unquote, or some of the positive responses to this dilemma, Jim and Matt, or anything else you want to comment on at this point?
Oh, let's go.
Super. All right, so we're going to go. Jim has got another reading for us related to the intimacy piece.
Great. So let me spotlight here. Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
So I think I've not been burned out now for 2 or 3 years. It took me a long time to get out. It took me a long time to even recognize I was in burnout. I realized later on that I named it that. But it took me a little bit of time to recognize that, oh, things are different now. I don't feel this sense of exhaustion or this dread. And when I did, I then got interested in retracing my steps. I was like, how did that change? And I changed careers. I moved into a new house. There were some big things in life that were different, but those weren't it. It wasn't some change to my schedule or some new exercise routine. Some of the things that we see in pop culture media around, the 3 ways to solve your burnout, which again, Ed teased a little bit in the setup here, talking about solutions. And then he kind of pulled the word solution back. If we look at burnout as a dilemma, and there's no singular solution, I can't say, Sean, Melissa, Matt, like here's the pill, take this pill and you won't be burned out. Then what we need is something different. We need a set of strategies. That's how we can process dilemmas. And what I found, the strategy that I'd used unwittingly, was developing intimate connections, intimate relationships across every sphere of my life. I started getting real with friends. I started opening up to who I actually was and what was really going on for me, so that I could be seen and heard and then supported. And oftentimes that looked like me sharing things that felt shameful and opening up in ways that I was nervous about. It was a risk. And I got met so many times, consistently, repeatedly, by people who saw what was going on for me and oftentimes said, I've been through something like that too. And we formed this bond right away in those conversations. And I've since found that what I was doing, I was creating intimacy in every corner of my life. That's why I called the book Expansive Intimacy, because it's not just this narrow slice that we traditionally think of when we hear the word intimate or intimacy. It's not about a romantic sexual relationship. I mean, yes, it is. It's great to have that. But how do we have it in other places? Colleagues, friends, children, extended family, wherever we can find it. So I'd love to read a passage from the book on that. This comes from the chapter called Defining Expansive Intimacy, and it starts on page 124. This is going to be a little bit more of this isn't so story-based, it's a little bit more of the research, a little bit of story, and a little bit more of the theory that I found. As social beings, we are wired to stick with external expectations, even when it causes us to painfully turn away from what we most want and need. Place that dynamic in a culture that shames men for desiring emotional connection, and it makes sense that men would abandon their needs for various forms of attachment to others. This topic also came up in one of my many discussions about intimacy with Shelley Lang, a psychotherapist who has focused her work on couples relationships. Full disclosure, Shelley is also my romantic partner. As we discuss this notion of how men might turn away from their needs for intimacy in favor of painful adherence to social norms, she raised an interesting observation from her professional practice. Sometimes, after years of dealing with negative encounters in relationships, people can lose sight of their needs for intimate connection altogether. This disconnect can happen when we avoid or shut down painful situations frequently, to the point that we no longer even recognize what we want. It's not that we're overriding the signals that lead us towards intimacy, it's that we've disconnected from those signals altogether. Note, this behavior is not strictly something that happens with men. Rather, it's one additional layer that can help us understand the challenges people might face when accessing intimacy. I saw a funny example of this phenomenon during the introductory section of a workshop I was attending a few years ago. The facilitator had asked us to share our names, where we worked, and something personal about ourselves. One man introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Mike." Then, without missing a beat, he gestured with his hand, sweeping it from the base of his neck to the top of his head, saying, "I work from here up." The room erupted in laughter. I can't even remember if he answered the third question about something personal, though perhaps he spoke volumes with his sarcastic revelation that suggests a man should operate from his logical head rather than his vulnerable heart. Indeed, by following the social norms that protect us from shame, we can become desensitized to our needs for intimacy. Yet Dr. Michael Kaler, who has studied the social norms for men in Western culture for over 2 decades, points out a critical truth that holds great promise. He punctuates his talk about the rules for men with this powerful finding. Research shows that the rules that men are expected to live within, being aggressive, strong, and tough, aren't what men actually want. In other words, men are strongly discouraged, if not forbidden, from pursuing both what they want and what they need. As a result, men face a bind with intimacy. When we try to reconcile our innate need for connection with the social norms that tell us to ignore them, we frequently end up choosing pain-inducing cultural expectations over the pleasureful connections we truly want. Deep down, we might want intimacy, but instead, we choose to tough it out and endure the pain required to truly man up.
So powerful, Jim. Thank you for that. And I know we're going to have a chance for folks to respond to you and Matt in a second, but let me now turn things over to Matt. And you were going to talk about intimacy as well, Matt.
Yeah. So this passage is all about the return of intimacy. I didn't fully feel how barren living with my second wife had become until Connie took a shower at my apartment one morning. She'd spent Friday night with me and had a wedding to attend on Saturday. I was in my tiny kitchen cooking us scrambled eggs and hash browns, toast and tea. I wore my green bathrobe and brown leather slippers as I cooked. Meals with Connie were still a luxury. I walked through the butler's pantry and into the dining room to set our tea on the table. At the same time, Connie was finishing her preparations and opened the bathroom door. Her perfume mixed with the mist of her shower, and a warm, moist fog of sweet scent rolled down the small hallway and into the dining room. I stopped and inhaled deeply. Roses. The room smelled like roses, or the way that roses should smell. It was the sweetest smelling salts I'd known, because I woke up again. It had been years, I suddenly realized, since I noticed the smell of perfume on a woman. Years since I'd been around a woman who wanted to wear perfume, put on lace occasionally, and actually enjoy the company of a man, to enjoy my company. At that moment, an entire submerged part of me resurfaced. This was why women were so appealing, I remember now. I soaked in that perfumed moment, I was too enthralled to analyze the moment, or else I would have been terrified at how dead I'd been for so long. This domestic moment, cooking breakfast and smelling perfume, marks in my mind the start of my life with Connie. It would be another few weeks before she'd move into the main floor apartment below me. Connie and I christened our duplex the Shack after a B-52 song. Her sons thought it was the coolest house, with the spiral staircases inside and out. It reminded them of Batman's lair. Once, they introduced me to their friends by saying, "This is Matt. He lives on top of our mom." In the duplex, Connie and I each had our own spaces and lives away from the draining marriages of the past. We had quiet times and places to write, to read, and to reclaim who we were from who we had become to survive. We attended classes together, and we shared a secret spiral staircase. We ate together often. On Friday afternoons, we'd have lunch in her apartment while listening to This American Life on National Public Radio. We'd wash dishes together and read together and sleep together the nights when her sons were with their dad.
Thank you, Matt. I am just struck at the outset here about how you guys together talked about this concept of expansive intimacy in such lovely ways. And Jim getting at the power of expanding it in all areas of your life and talking about how men really want this. And your story, Matt, reminds me that intimacy that we want and need as men, probably all human beings, isn't just the sexual, but the affectionate, the connection, the way you and Connie had a wider, you weren't just about, naked out of the shower, Connie, with rose perfume. It's about this relationship that you were building that was really intimate. So thank you both for that. And I'm going to have a chance to kind of respond in general to these passages and to the themes. But let me ask another question for the chat for everybody that we wanted to get some thoughts with. If you're willing, again, to be a little vulnerable, who in your life would you like to share more intimacy with? Again, asking people to put themselves out there a bit if you feel comfortable. And as people answer that, I don't know if Jim or Matt, if you want to put a little more color into this question.
I mean, I'd invite if anybody would rather share that out loud instead of in the chat. We're kind of opening up for Q&A after this anyways, so we can do it that way as well if anyone's so inclined.
Oh, that's a good point. I like that procedural change. I will say for me, reading some of the reviews of my book on Amazon, several people, family and friends, have said, I knew the author at the time, but I had no idea. So I guess I gotta tell more people more stuff. So I guess it's D, all of the above for me.
Matt, I was living next door at the time, as you well know, and
Right.
we knew.
Yeah.
And you showed incredible strength and grace.
Thank you, Ken.
And having lived next door to Matt for, I don't know, what, 10 years maybe?
Yeah.
And living in the same house for 22 years, and then moving clear across the country with my small nuclear family still intact, leaving the entire infrastructure of friends behind has left an incredible void over the last 15 years. And getting to midlife and beyond, it's very difficult to form new friendships, especially in a big city where everybody's too busy and already set in their friendship. So there's a real big void there.
Thanks for sharing that.
Ken, that notion comes up a lot for me in the work that I do, that for men in particular, that's who I work with. But I've talked to a lot of men who've said, I've reached midlife and I've realized that I don't have my friendships anymore. Work has gotten in the way, family has gotten in the way, I've moved, whatever the circumstances are, and it's hard to make new friends. And I agree. And it requires risk. I think that's the big thing, is we have to put ourselves out there in ways that can feel awkward, uncomfortable, and we're seeking intimacy in a world that doesn't always embrace it. And being the one to put that out there can be tough. But I'll say from my experience, as I went through that, as I started to push myself further and further out on the limb, I kept finding people were actually really craving it. So just encourage you, if there are places that you're drawn to move your foot in that direction and see what happens.
I saw Lisa shared about a son's significant other. Thanks for that. Anyone else feel called to share on this question?
I keep talking, so I don't want to name. You know, I've been looking at this issue, this challenge a lot, and what I keep finding is like the age that men stop making friends is 35. And the number of friends is diminished 5-fold over the last like 20 years. There's the number of friends that men have in their circle. And just when I think about, I've just moved, this is my 4th move in 2.5 years to 4 different major cities, or 3 different major cities, and starting over in each city. And like I'm learning from the challenge of the prior city in terms of how to do this at almost 50, and make the connections. So it's a humbling thing to start over with friend circles in a new city, where it would have just been an extension of, okay, what was my life in New York? Then what was my life in DC? And now what is it in Philadelphia? And starting to create, to create it over and over again. And I'm learning, it's definitely not impossible, but it takes like pretty much where I'm at is anything I did in DC, I'm doing the complete opposite in Philadelphia. So whatever didn't work there, and it's just taking a very different level of effort, and consciousness and intentionality, to create those connections, deepen those connections and friendships. But man, it'd be easier if I was 27 doing this as opposed to 49. So.
Go ahead, Jay. Thank you, Sean. Jay?
So for 10 years, I've been privileged to belong to a men's organization. That's a men's entrepreneurial organization. You can find it at metal, METAL .MEN. I've had in my life a handful of really, really close men friends, and that's been a privilege, but this was an opportunity to open up to a range of men and develop really a kind of brotherhood. It's also, maybe combine some of the best TED Talks and sharings that you'll ever find as part of the composite mental.men. So I would say, listening to you and hearing the conversation, every one of you would be an accepted brother, given the quality of this conversation and where your heads are at and where your hearts are at. So I would encourage you to think about checking it out. You can scroll down. It talks about having a guest come as a guest and feel your way into it. And there's a lot of great stuff happening. And it's a way of developing really deep, caring relationships with other men who are quite evolved and quite on the path. So that would be my input.
Thank you, Jay. Well, with that, I want to see if we can open up generally Q&A for Jim and Matt today. We had some great comments. I really appreciate the willingness to put yourselves out there, folks. Any general questions for Matt or Jim, or the passages you've heard so far today? I think there's you've answered all the questions, I guess, Jim and Matt.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Julian.
I know Matt's story a little bit better than Jim's, but I'm curious if this, well, for either one of you, Matt, I know you were putting yourself under a little bit of pressure to get this book out. And I'm curious if there was any meta burnout that either of you felt from the creation process of your books.
Interesting
Matt.
question. For me, it almost like there's just right now it's, and I think I say this in the book, it's kind of a dumb thing for me to do this book. I don't really need the work. It's not going to make me rich or famous. It's just going to add to my long list of things to do that is mostly self-inflicted. And so, you know, do I really need to take on even more stuff? And so that kind of sorts to push towards exhaustion a little bit, frankly, when it's yet another thing to do. But on the other hand, it's also, you know, part of that pushing me to be more of myself, to share more of myself, to do more of who I want to be. And so that's what I come back to is even if I, you know, this doesn't make me rich and famous. And it, you know, I wrote this 15 years ago. I probably should have done this then, but for all sorts of reasons, I didn't. So kinda, I guess is my answer, but an interesting question. Jim, what about you?
I think that's such a good question, Julia, because I had to watch myself as I was going through various points in the process, and especially parts that felt challenging to my skill sets. Because writing a book, I'd never written a book before. It's a big endeavor. I have so much appreciation for anybody who's ever gone through the process, having done it. And a couple of times I definitely got to this place where I thought, oh, I'm pushing a little bit too hard when I was doing final editorial revisions, and there was so much, I had to hold the whole book in my head to try and make sure it was consistent. Like there's this huge mental load. And any of the marketing and promotion stuff has been stressful to me. I'm not a promoter. I don't like to push things. And so I've had to watch myself approach burnout because I know I have the gene. I can go into it pretty easily. And it was also cool because I wrote this book because it was like Matt, I'm not getting rich off of this book. I'm not going to change my life in a material way by publishing this book. The goal is actually to change other people's lives and help them see like, oh, there's this different way that I can go through life and not have to get into burnout. And I've been able to use the tools of the book to beat back the burnout that wants to encroach as I try to achieve more. And that was really validating. And I've gotten some really wonderful notes from people who somehow I don't even know who sent notes to say like this specific instance in my life that just came up was better because of what I read in the book. And like, that's it. Like there's the reward. And that also helps with the burnout because I'm like, okay, the book is out. I get to now just let it do what it needs to do. And hopefully it's helping people. So yeah, definitely had to worry about a little burnout there.
I just was saying, I'm not surprised to hear that, Jim. Super happy to hear you say that. But having read Jim's book, it's really got awesome material in there and ideas, but also the wider mindset that you're capturing, Jim, about the intimacy as this antidote and way forward. So, yay. I wonder if there's another question or two, and then we're going to do our book giveaways. Anyone else with a question or a curiosity or comment on what Matt and Jim have shared today? Johnny, what's on your mind, Johnny? Johnny is our 90-year-old attendee, Matt's mother. Yeah, I know you've got something to say, Johnny.
There you go.
Oh, I have the happy circumstance of being so proud of the 3 children we raised. They are wonderful human beings, all 3 of them.
Even the black sheep, Matt?
Even
Okay.
black.
Yeah, he was the baby of the bunch, but all of them have wonderful wives, husbands. Who else can say that of their family?
That's a lovely sentiment. Talk about a way to beat back shame, have parental approval and love like that. So thank you,
Well,
John.
My husband was a military helicopter rescue pilot, Vietnam, Korea, for 20 years. And he's been known to come home at night and hand me the car keys and say, I'm leaving for Okinawa in the morning. Ship the car, bring the kid, I'll meet you on the other end.
Wow.
They learn from that kind of a life, and they learn it well.
Mm.
They're very well-adjusted human beings.
Most of the time.
Thank
Or
you,
now.
Johnny and Lisa. All right. Well, speaking of getting well adjusted, let's give away some books. If you are willing to put your email address in the chat, we will do a quick drawing here, and you can win one of Matt's book, Jim's book, and even as they offered, I'm also going to throw in my book. Can't even hold them all at the same time. This Reinventing Masculinity, the Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection. A lot of overlap with what these two fellows have been talking about. So I think we're asking people to put your email in the chat, right, Matt and Jim? That's our little process here.
Yeah,
No?
because we need a way to get a hold of you to get your address to
Intimacy
send you
women.
your book.
Julia,
Yeah, so
Um,
you will probably get to request the one you want, because I know there are people here who have my book or Jim's book or Ed's book, but you may not have the others. So yeah.
Can
I
we
have all
just
three.
assume- Does anybody, maybe we do an opt-out thing here for the sake of time. Anyone not want one of these books? Because we could just kind of do a little quick drawing that way. I see people giving their emails in.
So good to see you, Melissa. I know you got to go.
Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa.
Thank you. Take
All
care.
right. Bye-bye.
Jim, do you want to do the drawing here or drawings? I don't know if we had a particular
Well,
picker.
we didn't actually figure out a system for how we're going to do the drawing. Maybe we do that when we close the curtain. We can do this post production, and we'll let you know.
That's nice. All right. So yeah, you may be surprised by getting an email saying you want a book. Okay, so we wanted to kind of first, I want to thank everybody for coming here today, and thank Jim and Matt for really the brave work you've done here and important work. Already starting to see the impact of it. I wanted to give Jim and Matt a chance to just close us out with a little gem of wisdom, a final word or two. So, Jim, you want to go first, and then we'll end with Matt.
Yeah, first, I just want to offer gratitude. Thanks for showing up and being in conversation with us today. To me, one of the essential parts of the work that I do around intimacy and stepping into that is getting out into conversations, talking about things that matter and that are real. And I love that you all are doing that. So thanks for coming out today.
I would say it's great seeing everybody, especially some folks who I hadn't seen in quite a while. I can. But I will say one thing I've learned throughout life, and I'm always trying to get better at this, is listen to yourself. I mean, you have that little voice telling you that, oh, I'm burned out, I'm tired, something's not right, I need to do something different. And that little voice gets overridden a lot. I know it has in my life. And once I listen to that, things get better. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Jim. Thanks, everyone, again. And we'll end on that beautiful note, listening to the voices, working on your intimacy, and fighting burnout. Have a great rest of your day. And we will be in touch with our book winners soon.